For 30 years, Johnny Carson was the undisputed king of late night, the man who brought the biggest stars of the golden age directly into the living rooms of millions of Americans. To the viewers sitting at home, those interviews felt like watching old friends catching up over coffee, anchored by Carson's warm smile and his signature easy laugh. It was a world of glamour, wit, and effortless charm where every guest seemed like the pinnacle of Hollywood royalty. But there was a darker side to The Tonight Show that the public never saw. When the cameras stopped rolling and the studio lights dimmed, that famous Carson smile often vanished into a mask of professional exhaustion or quiet disgust. Behind that iconic mahogany desk, Johnny was doing more than just making jokes. He was observing. According to those who worked in his inner circle, Carson kept a meticulous mental blacklist of celebrities he believed were truly awful human beings. While he remained the ultimate professional on the air, he would often lean over to Ed McMahon during commercial breaks to whisper that a guest should never be allowed near a camera or a child again. As he entered his later years, Carson began to open up about the beloved icons he secretly despised, painting a chilling picture of predators, abusers, and manipulators who were protected by the industry while the world only saw their carefully crafted public images. He believed that the camera didn't just add weight, it added a layer of fiction. For Carson, the ultimate test of a person's character wasn't how they treated him, but how they treated the people with the least amount of power, the production assistants, the makeup artists, and the stagehands. Today, we are pulling back the curtain on the 7 most notorious names from that secret list. These are the stars who thought they were untouchable, only to discover that the most powerful man in television had seen exactly who they were when the red light went out. This is the truth behind Johnny Carson's private war against the dark side of Hollywood glamour. The friction between Johnny Carson and the legendary Frank Sinatra is perhaps the most famous example of professional admiration clashing with personal revulsion. On screen, their chemistry appeared effortless, with Sinatra playing the part of the charming raconteur, while Carson played the gracious host. To the millions watching at home, they looked like the ultimate pair of old-school friends sharing a laugh. However, the reality behind the scenes was far less friendly. Carson deeply respected Sinatra's immense musical talent, but he could not stand the way Old Blue Eyes treated people when the cameras weren't rolling. Carson once confided to a close friend that if Sinatra didn't sing, he would have likely been a mob enforcer. In Carson's eyes, Sinatra was both a brilliant artist and a professional bully. Every time Sinatra visited The Tonight Show, the atmosphere backstage turned thick with tension. He never traveled alone, always arriving with an entourage of 6 to 8 men who looked more like street enforcers than show business associates. These men would fan out across the studio, watching the staff with an intensity that made the crew feel like they were under constant surveillance. What truly disturbed Carson, however, was Sinatra's blatant disregard for anyone he considered beneath him. During one specific taping in the early 1970s, a floor manager gave Sinatra the standard 3-minute warning before his segment. Sinatra reportedly grabbed the man, a veteran in his 50s, by his tie and growled that nobody tells him when he has 3 minutes. Carson watched this on a monitor and was so disgusted he nearly canceled the segment on the spot. From that day on, Carson's smiles toward Sinatra were a feat of pure professionalism rather than genuine friendship. This quiet disgust was only amplified by Sinatra's notorious unreliability and his habit of canceling appearances at the last minute, sometimes even after he had already arrived at the studio. The breaking point for Carson came during a commercial break when Sinatra made a crude remark about a female staff member's appearance. Carson, breaking his usual calm, turned to the singer and coldly stated that they did not talk about his staff that way in his studio. The air in the room went still, and even Sinatra was stunned into silence by the challenge. When the cameras returned, the smiles were back, but the heat was gone. Carson immediately instructed his producers to limit Sinatra's appearances to once a year at most. For a man who rarely interfered with guest bookings, this was a massive statement of intent. To Carson, Sinatra's arrogance and cruelty had crossed a line that no amount of star power could excuse. If Sinatra was the intimidating bully, Jerry Lewis represented a different kind of darkness that Carson found equally repellent, the overwhelming ego that turned into pure arrogance. While millions saw Lewis as a comic genius and a dedicated humanitarian for his telethons, Carson and his crew saw a man who was demeaning and profoundly self-absorbed. Carson famously remarked that Lewis was what happens when ego outruns talent. During his appearances, Lewis would often dominate the conversation, interrupting other guests, and even reaching over to adjust Carson's tie without permission, a boundary-crossing gesture that visibly irritated the host. The behavior Lewis exhibited toward the production crew was even more egregious. He reportedly refused to learn the names of the staff, addressing them only by their job titles, and once exploded at a camera operator for the simple act of breathing too loudly during a rehearsal. What disgusted Carson most was the glaring hypocrisy of Lewis's public image as a champion for children, contrasted with his private treatment of working-class people who couldn't help his career. This two-faced act made Carson's skin crawl. Following a particularly unpleasant appearance in the early 1980s, Carson effectively banned Lewis from the show, stating that in a town full of phonies, Lewis stood out as truly hateful. For Carson, these two men were the blueprints for the kind of golden age toxicity he refused to tolerate in his house. While some stars brought an atmosphere of intimidation, others arrived with a chilling sense of control that left the Tonight Show staff feeling as though they were walking on glass. Joan Crawford, the legendary Hollywood queen, was the embodiment of this icy persona. When she appeared on the show in 1970, the audience saw a woman of impeccable style and practiced charm. However, those behind the scenes saw a woman who was nothing like her public image. Carson later described her as one of the coldest people he had ever interviewed, famously remarking that talking to her was like talking to a beautiful, empty statue. The difficulty with Crawford began long before she stepped onto the stage. Her team submitted a 4-page list of specific technical demands that became a legend among the crew. These requirements dictated the exact angle of her chair, the height of Johnny's desk, and a studio temperature that had to be maintained at exactly 67 degrees. Despite the show having its own award-winning staff, Crawford brought her own makeup team and treated the workers according to their perceived status. While she was polite to Johnny, she was vicious toward those she viewed as beneath her. The most disturbing incident occurred when a young production assistant accidentally entered Crawford's dressing room with a requested glass of water. Crawford reportedly exploded into a tirade, calling the young woman a fool and suggesting she work in a brothel instead. The assistant fled in tears, and while Crawford demanded she be fired, Carson's producer refused. What truly unsettled Carson was the machine-like precision with which Crawford switched back to a warm, smiling persona the moment the cameras turned on. During commercial breaks, she would instantly drop the act and sit in a blank, terrifying silence. After the show, Carson reportedly told Ed McMahon that he had interviewed corpses with more personality. When her daughter's memoir later exposed allegations of abuse, Carson expressed that he wasn't surprised, as he felt he had seen her true nature in those few hours. If Crawford was a machine of cold precision, Zsa Zsa Gabor was a hurricane of vanity that nearly drove Carson to the breaking point. A frequent guest, Gabor was beloved by audiences for her thick Hungarian accent and her witty jokes about her many marriages. Behind the curtain, however, she was considered one of the most demanding guests in the show's history. Carson once joked that he would rather interview a cat because it wouldn't require 3 assistants and custom lighting. Gabor's list of demands was so extensive it read like a comedy sketch. She required her dressing room to be exactly 74 degrees, insisted on fresh orchids rather than carnations, and demanded a specific bottle of water with exactly 3 ice cubes. Most notably, she demanded that no female guests under the age of 40 appear on the same episode as her. If any detail was missed, she would refuse to leave her dressing room, causing massive delays for the crew and other guests. One infamous tantrum occurred when the makeup department lacked her preferred foundation, leading to a shouting match that forced Carson himself to intervene. What truly infuriated Carson was the disregard Gabor showed for the professional ecosystem of the show. Her lateness and demands forced crew members to work overtime and left other performers waiting in the wings. After one particularly exhausting session where she arrived 40 minutes late, Carson told his producer that next time they should just rename the program the Za Gabor Show, and he would play the sidekick. Though she remained a ratings draw, her behavior earned her a permanent spot on the list of stars who valued their own reflection more than the people working to make them look good. While some guests were difficult because of their coldness or their vanity, Orson Welles presented a challenge that tested the very structure of The Tonight Show. To the audience, Welles was a captivating raconteur, a man with a booming voice, and a library of fascinating stories from the golden age of cinema. He appeared on the couch as a brilliant visionary, but to Johnny Carson and his production team, he was a man so consumed by his own legend that he believed the rules of television simply did not apply to him. Carson, a man who prided himself on precision and respect for the craft of broadcasting, found Welles's total disregard for show structure especially infuriating. The issues often began before Welles even arrived at the studio. According to the show's writers, Welles routinely rejected every question or topic the team prepared for the interview, once handing back a blank page, after calling their work pedestrian and obvious. This left Carson in the nearly impossible position of having to interview one of history's greatest cinematic figures with no guidance or structure whatsoever. Once the cameras were rolling, Welles would launch into meandering monologues that were almost impossible to edit for time. He treated The Tonight Show as if it were his own production, bringing props without warning, and even attempting to direct the camera operators from his seat on the couch. The most notorious incident occurred during a mid-1970s appearance, where Welles was scheduled for a 7-minute segment. Instead of following the plan, he stayed on the couch for nearly 25 minutes, completely ignoring every subtle cue Carson used to signal that the segment was over. Carson had a sophisticated system of nonverbal signals, tapping his pencil or shifting in his seat, that everyone in the industry understood. Welles saw them all and simply kept talking. As a result, 2 other scheduled guests never made it to the air that night. Off-camera, Welles's behavior was equally dismissive. He refused to address production assistants directly, instead speaking about them as if they were invisible, referring to them as the girl or the boy, even when they were standing right beside him. After one particularly chaotic taping, Carson turned to Ed McMahon and muttered that genius does not excuse everything, and being brilliant does not give someone the right to hijack another person's show. While Carson continued to praise Welles publicly as a visionary privately, he viewed him as a cautionary tale of how an unchecked ego can eventually overshadow even the greatest talent. For a host who valued the professional ecosystem of his set, Welles was a brilliant but deeply problematic presence who left a trail of frustrated crew members in his wake. If Orson Welles challenged the clock, Bette Davis challenged the very spirit of the conversation. When the Hollywood legend appeared on The Tonight Show, audiences saw a sharp, magnetic icon brimming with wit. However, the moments before and after the cameras rolled told a much darker story of a temper and a sharp tongue that turned the studio atmosphere ice cold. Carson famously remarked to Ed McMahon that Davis didn't need a stage, she needed a courtroom, and that no one should be cross-examined by her without a lawyer present. Davis was a verbal force of nature who frequently targeted other guests. She had a habit of interrupting others mid-sentence, particularly younger performers, and would even turn her back to them on the couch. If another guest received a big laugh, witnesses recalled that Davis would visibly fume, immediately plotting how to reclaim the spotlight. Off-camera, her behavior was even more difficult to manage. Known for requesting whiskey in her dressing room, her drinking often led to sharp, inappropriate remarks. Staff members from the 1970s recalled her using sexist and racist language that was shocking even for that era. Carson, who usually avoided direct conflict, was finally forced to intervene when Davis began berating a cue card operator during rehearsal. He quietly told her that on his show, everyone was spoken to with respect, or they wouldn't speak at all. Despite his deep admiration for her talent, Carson eventually decided that life was too short to be verbally flogged by Davis, and stopped inviting her back in the early 1980s. The tension brought by Shelley Winters was of an entirely different, more volatile nature. A two-time Academy Award winner, Winters was expected to be a perfect guest, but she became known behind the scenes as one of the most unpredictable storms Carson ever faced. Carson once noted that Shelley didn't just talk, she detonated. She frequently ignored the show's lighthearted tone, instead launching into impassioned political speeches or startling personal confessions that left Carson struggling to steer the segment. During one appearance, a simple question about a film spiraled into a 5-minute monologue on government corruption, leaving the production team in a panic. Her reputation for physical outbursts was so well known that the Tonight Show stage managers would actually remove breakable objects from the set before she arrived. While Carson was visibly uneasy during her heated moments, he did respect her authenticity, noting that she truly believed every word she said. Nevertheless, her refusal to play by the rules of polished entertainment made her a constant source of anxiety for the host and his crew, while ego and volatility were constant challenges on the late-night stage. Johnny Carson encountered a much darker brand of misconduct that crossed the line from difficult to predatory. Mickey Rooney, once the biggest box office draw in the world and a living link to Hollywood's golden age, became infamous among the Tonight Show crew for all the wrong reasons. Carson eventually became so disgusted by Rooney's behavior that he reportedly told his producer the actor seemed to think his short stature gave him permission to be a pervert. By the mid-1970s, Rooney had developed a reputation for unwanted, touching, crude jokes and a total disregard for professional boundaries. The situation became so severe that younger production assistants would frequently beg to be reassigned whenever they saw Rooney's name on the schedule. Staff members recalled him grabbing their hands or pulling them uncomfortably close while asking personal questions about their marital status. Rooney also struggled with visible intoxication during his appearances, slurring his words and losing his train of thought on at least 3 separate occasions. During a notorious 1977 segment, he began sharing an anecdote about Judy Garland that turned so inappropriate that Carson was forced to cut him off and abruptly change the subject. After a particularly uncomfortable taping where Rooney made suggestive comments toward a young female guest, Carson took the rare step of personally apologizing to the woman, telling her that such behavior was not how professionals acted on his show. From that point on, Carson insisted that Rooney's segments be pre-taped during the day rather than broadcast live. If Rooney's behavior was a violation of personal boundaries, Jane Russell's downfall on The Tonight Show was a matter of fundamental principle. A defining sex symbol of the 1940s and 50s, Russell was a Hollywood legend whose glamour initially made her an obvious choice for the show. However, after only a few appearances in the early 1970s, she virtually vanished from the guest list. The reason was a hard line that Carson drew regarding intolerance. According to staff accounts, Russell frequently made disparaging and harsh comments about LGBTQ+ individuals working behind the scenes. In one instance, she allegedly refused to let a gay makeup artist perform her touch-ups, demanding a replacement. Even more troubling was her treatment of fellow stars like Rock Hudson. Russell reportedly refused to appear on the same episode as Hudson, making insulting remarks about his sexuality, which, while not public knowledge at the time, was an open secret in Hollywood circles. Carson, who counted many gay friends among his close inner circle, was deeply offended by her prejudice. The final straw occurred in 1973, when Russell was overheard making dismissive remarks about recent civil rights legislation during a commercial break. Though these comments were never broadcast, they sealed her fate. Carson quietly but permanently removed her from the roster. For a host who rarely interfered in bookings based on personal politics, this was a powerful statement that he would not tolerate discrimination or cruelty in his studio. Johnny Carson's private blacklist offers a revealing look at the darker reality beneath the glamorous surface of Hollywood's golden age. For 30 years, every major celebrity passed through his studio, giving him a unique vantage point to distinguish between those who were genuine and those who merely played a part. While the world saw carefully crafted public images, Carson witnessed the predators, abusers, and manipulators who were often protected by the industry. His judgments were rarely motivated by petty gossip or professional grudges. Instead, Carson utilized a simple but profound test. He observed how these icons treated the people with the least power, such as the pages, the assistants, and the camera crews. To him, a star's behavior toward a production assistant was a far more accurate measure of their character than any rehearsed interview on his couch. In the years following his death, many of these private assessments were validated as public reports of abuse, arrogance, and misconduct regarding these stars began to surface. Carson's legacy remains that of a man who could see through the fiction to the truth underneath. He understood that while a career could be built on a charming smile, a person's true nature is revealed in the moments when the spotlight is turned off. If you found this deep dive into the hidden history of late night fascinating, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Memories of the Stars. We have much more to share about the legends you thought you knew and the secrets they tried to keep. Thank you for watching, and we will see you in the next chapter of Hollywood's Untold Stories.